We share some interesting free agent names the Bucks could possibly target here this offseason, and our thoughts on the NBA Finals as it begins tonight, coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis and a Frank Madden episode as well. We thank you for making this your first listen of the day each and every day. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Well, the offseason continues chugging along here, and we figured let's take a look at some interesting names that are out there. We'll take a look outside of the Bucks scope of things. We've talked about the importance and how that rates with the players they have internally, but it's going to be an interesting offseason, and I guess that's the place to start here is free agents outside of Milwaukee because Frank, you were mentioning this before we started recording, and Camille and I have kind of talked about this as well. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about what this market is going to be, and probably in a good way for teams like the Bucks, where it's one of the things we've talked about these last two off seasons now is basically the death of the middle class. And when you talk about players the Bucks would love to retain, and we mentioned, well, there's really two teams that have any sizable cap space here that where's the money going to come from when you're talking about the Bucks in half the league basically has the non-tax pyramid level. That's about it for the spending spree. And all those players the Bucks have that they're hoping to retain at best are kind of ranking somewhere in the middle positionally for the free agents that are out there.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be an interesting dynamic this summer because now with the TV deal, is kicking in, and we're basically going to be in this world of 10% cap increases every summer, which is the kind of negotiated maximum the cap can go up in future years. It would go up a lot more if it could, but essentially they wanted to minimize. What was it? 2016, I guess, was the kind of crazy year of Timothy Mozgov $70 million contracts or whatever it was. So
Bucks cashed in too with guys like Mirza Teletovic and
was Delhi that year? Was that the Delhi?
I believe wasn't it Delhi and Mirza that were their big splashes?
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
We'll always have the first quarter buzzer beating layup by Delhi in that Celtics game 3 or 4 or whatever that was. That was magical.
Still one of the loudest moments I've heard.
That's a litmus test moment. If people don't know about that, they're not a legit Bucks fan. If you don't know about that moment,
I have a great Mirza Teletovic story that I'll share at some point to that day that he was introduced in the signing of Mirza.
I feel like the time is now. I mean, you already brought it up.
All right. So the Bucks were introducing Mirza Teletovic, and
a magical moment for all of us.
Magical day. I think this is my first or second year in seat of that role that I had with the Bucks. And I was asked, hey, do you want to interview Mirza Teletovic for the radio and do that? So I said, all right, sure. And that was back in the day before Fiserv, where the Bucks would do those press conferences at various places, like Jabari's intro, wasn't it at the public market?
Public market.
And this Mirza interview and intro and press conference was at the Pfister in the lobby. So the setup for me interviewing Mirza Teletovic was I had to meet with, I think it was Dan, I can't remember, but Bucks PR. And they took me up to a hotel room where it was just me, Mirza Teletovic, and 2 of his guys. And like, all right, where do you want to do this? And he just sits on the bed for me to interview him and like motions of like, all right, sit down right here. So it's me for 7 minutes.
Did he pat his head?
Just sitting on a bed in the Pfister, like, how excited are you to be in Milwaukee?
There are a lot of jokes I want to use with that, but I know the
I don't know if we can
network
make those
standards
jokes
here
anymore.
This is not the time.
So they never did an intro at the Rockies at Bayshore, unfortunately, but maybe something for the future. Anyway, so free agency 2025. So I think an interesting dynamic here. We've got kind of the cap now is going to be going up 10% every year, which is also affects the aprons, the tax level, like everything's kind of going up, which given, we're now at what, $154 million cap. Last year was 140. Do the math, 140 plus 10%, 154. A year from now, it's going to be, at 170 or so for the cap, and everything else kind of going up that, which is why, as you guys have been talking about, and we talked about, the second apron isn't really in play for the Bucks anymore, even though they still have Dame and Giannis making these massive contracts, and you still have obviously other guys eating up a fair bit of the cap. So you have sort of on the one hand, you have, the cap increases now providing more breathing room. But on the other side, you do have also the same fundamental rules about the first apron, the second apron, and the kind of harsh penalties that come with that, the limitations that you have when you get close to or over those things, things like freezing draft picks and all that other stuff. So the penalties are still really high for kind of getting into that kind of rarefied air. So it's going to be interesting just to see, as you were alluding to, Justin, do we continue to see that sort of, call it flight to quality, right? Like basically teams sort of hoarding money on their top 3, 4, 5 rotation guys and really being wary of giving, like the backup point guard or the 6 man, $18 million a year, $20 million a year, whatever it might be. Or, do we see teams start to throw money around a little bit? But I mean, aside from the Brooklyn Nets, it's not like there are a ton of teams with, multiple max slots. I think Brooklyn might be the only team that has max slot available. And so when that happens, obviously then you start to have to kind of make this take into consideration, right? Like what extensions are you going to have to do with your current guys? And, again, just kind of how you manage things moving forward. And so I think it's going to be an interesting litmus test a bit of like where the league is. Like our team's going to start opening up their pocketbooks a bit more and spending a bit more given the kind of trajectory of the cap. Because again, like the most raises you can give your current own players is 8% of first year salary, of outside free agents is 5%. The cap's going to be outpacing that, right? So basically any deal you sign multi-year is going to be declining in terms of the percentage of the total cap that it's going to be. So it's going to be interesting, but yeah, I think the sense that, I don't get the sense that suddenly teams are going to be throwing out full mid-level deals to guys that, are not going to be starters or are like so-so players or really unproven guys. And, I think we'll just have to see kind of what that means for the Bucks. But obviously to the extent that teams look at, the shooting guard position and say, Gary Trent, nice job off the bench last year, but you're not going to start for, I don't know how many teams he would start for. Probably starts for the Bucks.
Absolutely.
Him or AJ Green. I think both guys, would be totally adequate in that spot, and the other one would play big minutes off the bench. But is there more than a taxpayer mid-level size deal available for a Gary Trent? I kind of put that as maybe sort of the over/under. And I've been talking about splitting that mid-level up across multiple guys, including, Gary and Kevin Porter Jr. being the principal guys. But who knows, right? I mean, I don't know. Kevin Porter Jr., given his history, he is making more than the minimum if he opts into his player option. I had assumed he would opt out and at least try to get a little bit more money on a 1-year deal to try to cash in on the good times he had with the Bucks. Like, can you get a 1+1 or something like that? Given that he's probably gonna, if he stays, would have an opportunity to play a ton and put up numbers, and perhaps most importantly, just stay out of trouble for a second straight year, which, I mean, again, like for him, that's like honestly job one. If you're his agent, like that's your biggest thing is like, dude, just like be a good teammate, stay out of trouble, keep your head on straight, and play the way you're capable of playing. So yeah, I think, when I was talking about sort of initial scenarios, my first question was just like, all right, if you wanted to retain kind of all your key guys, which again, anybody looking at it is going to be like, you want to run back a team that's lost in the first round like multiple years in a row that also doesn't have Dame Lillard? I get that, but I would also say, the wings and guards are all like in a good age range, right?
Mhm.
When you look at KPJ and his age, you look at Gary Trent still being only 26. I think it makes sense to try to keep those guys. You've got AJ Green, you can extend him this summer. And then with the big guys, honestly, as we've discussed, it's more just a question of like, who else are you going to get? As much as people may not be enamored with Brook Lopez anymore, stretch bigs are just in very short supply, and stretch bigs that can actually defend, at least in certain situations, right? And Brook may be more of a situational guy at this point, but go find a rim protector who can play next to Giannis that can hit threes. Like,
It's hard to do.
you're not doing it for less than the mid-level pretty much. So yeah, it's just a really interesting position, but it also, I think, raises the question, if any of these guys do leave, then how do you use some of that flexibility, whether it's the $7 million trade exception or the biannual exception or part of that mid-level? What do you do at that point? And obviously, you can benefit from either re-signing your own guys for less money or potentially finding maybe some value on the free agent market, which, give credit to John Horst. We can question certain things that John Horst has done, but he has been able to find guys consistently on the margins with very little money to spend in free agency, whether it was Malik Beasley a couple of years ago, obviously GTJ this past year, and obviously get more than a minimum level of value from those guys.
Camille, I want to take a look at the shooting guards, I suppose, in the bigs in the free agent market for those two areas, and how it impacts the Bucks when you look at some of those guys in the group with players like Gary Trent Jr. and obviously Brook and Bobby, if he opts out as well. So what that could look like, and why we keep saying, I don't know what the money is going to be for these guys in terms of it. It's probably not going to be as high as the figures we've seen kicked around from some Bucks fans. We'll get into that discussion coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. The NBA playoffs in full swing now, and every night is delivering highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. Think about what it would look like to combine live prop bets mid-game in the NBA Finals here based on how the action is unfolding. If you've got a read on who's heating up, back it up with a same-game parlay. And how could a $200 bonus in bets add to the excitement if your first $5 bet hits? If you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So the list of free agents, let's just start with two guards. Malik Beasley is going to be a free agent. He got what, $6 million from the Pistons? I mean, I don't know. He's going to be an interesting one to see how close to the mid-level number does that move. I don't think he's getting the full mid-level, but you got Nickeil Alexander-Walker of the Timberwolves as a free agent. Quentin Grimes is a free agent. Cam Thomas, an interesting name, but 23 years old. He can score. I would assume there's a larger market for Cam Thomas than there's going to be for Gary Trent Jr. So that's where you start to get to some of these names and say, okay, at the two-guard spot alone, we've just rattled off four names that are up there. Kevin Porter Jr. is certainly in the mix with Gary Trent Jr. as well. You've got value propositions potentially like a Sam Merrill and Karis LeVert. Bruce Brown, one of the interesting names. DeAnthony Melton coming off of that torn ACL. So there's varying levels of impacts, but there's a lot of names that are out there. But I think without question, Gary Trent Jr. at best is probably going to be fourth or fifth in the pecking order for two guards this summer. So that's where it comes into play that we mentioned quite a bit. I don't think he's getting close to the full non-tax mid-level. And then when you're looking at the other names that are in front of him, that money's got to come somewhere. And if somebody's using half of the mid-level to sign, let's say, Malik Beasley is a bad example because he was already at that figure. But if you're using portions of that to sign guys in front of him, it just trickles on down the line. And that's why I don't really know what to make of this offseason with where is the money going to come from because of the fact that not a whole lot of teams have money to spend. And there's guys that I think ordinarily you would look at it and say, well, this guy's got to get close to $10 million. But to Frank's point, I do wonder as well if we've seen a shift in team building of, no, we think we can get this guy for close to the minimum part of, maybe the tax pyramid level, or we can get somebody that gives us 80% of that for that figure. And that's what we're going to do.
I mean, shoot, last offseason at the beginning of it, I don't think any of us would have thought that Gary Trent Jr. would sign for a vet, man. Like, as it went on and you saw that he wasn't being picked up, it was kind of like, well, maybe it does happen. And how the middle class is being shaped right now is interesting. Like, that's part of the debate of people saying the middle class in the NBA is dead at the moment. But we talked about it earlier with Van this week as well, of just like, I do wonder as we watch this finals unfold, as we see how the Thunder have built their team, how the Pacers have built their team, the type of players that they have, do more teams start putting more emphasis on those role players instead of moving away from that 1, 2, maybe big 3 superstar model? But for this offseason, I did see Peter Fagan was on Thanasis' podcast, and he made mention of the fact of just like, we don't have a lot of assets, so to speak, but like we're excited. And as team president, you got to be excited. You got to portray that optimism going forward. But just talking about like John Horst, and you mentioned it earlier too, Justin, of like, he tends to be able to try to find a way to try to make something out of what seems like nothing. And for years, we've been wondering, like the Drew Holiday trade felt like it came out of nowhere. The Dame trade felt like it came out of nowhere. But now with the asset pool just dried almost completely up. I think some of the guys that they're going to have to look for in free agency this year could be some of those guys who might be considered quote unquote damaged goods, or you're trying to see if they can take that next step. And that's why somebody like D'Anthony Melton, who is a name that's been thrown around for a few years from Bucks fans of like, would love to have him on the team, but he's coming off an ACL. He is a smaller shooting guard. He's only like 6'3" at the shooting guard position. So he's a smaller guy, but you get him for the minimum. Can you take a chance on a guy like that and see what that unfolds for you, especially if you can keep Gary Trent Jr., Kevin Porter Jr., you get Ryan Rollins back in the fold here. You have AJ Green. So you have a pretty good level of guard depth to start with. So like maybe you do take a chance on somebody like D'Anthony Melton of like, you're coming off of this ACL. We don't know what that looks like, but we know we can get a bargain contract out of this because of situation. So I do wonder if someone like that does pick up like for the Bucks, and it could be interesting, especially if the Bucks are able to bring back the guys that we saw start building continuity last year with Giannis being like the focal point of the offense.
And I'm honestly not that worried about the shooting guard spot, in part because I don't think I feel like, and again, not to over-index on the Bucks sort of situation the last few years, but in general, right? Like, yes, there are some superstar shooting guards, right? The Devin Booker types exist in the world. But the shooting guard's always been that spot where you just look for a guy who can make threes and defend adequately enough. And there's not a like shortage of guys that can sort
2
of
years ago. That's really pushing it, Frank.
And, so it's, and that's like the one thing, right? The Bucks have just been able to like just continuously reload, right? Like Dante DiVincenzo became Grayson Allen, became Malik Beasley, became Gary Trent Jr. And honestly, like, like we can look back and say like, oh man, they should have signed Dante, whatever it might be. It's like, they shouldn't have traded him for Serge Ibaka, but like, are they like, did they get into this predicament as a franchise because they didn't pay Dante DiVincenzo coming off his worst year? No, it took him a couple of years, honestly, to get back to a good place. And even this year, it took him a while to kind of get going again after that great year in New York. So I'm probably least worried about that, just because, worst case scenario, you have AJ Green, and honestly, I'd be totally content to start AJ Green. And so then, you've got, I think, options as like backup type guys. I would most probably at this point prefer just to bring back Gary Trent, and as we've been talking, I don't think you're gonna have to break the bank to do that. I think point guard is interesting because, you have a $54 million hole at the point guard position, and yes, like Kevin Porter Jr. and Ryan Rollins obviously had, nice moments last year. I think they played above and beyond what I think anybody expected them to. The Bucks had their 8-game win streak with those guys deputizing for Dame at the point guard position. But, if we're being realistic here, like I don't think anybody would look at those two guys and say like, oh, just re-sign those guys and then you're set for your gap year or whatever next year at the point guard position. I think you need more ball handling depth. Again, KPJ is a little bit of a unique case. And Rollins as well, like because honestly, like neither of them is really a true point guard. They just can handle it well enough to, get you into your offense. They can defend point guards, but they can also play off ball a fair bit as well. And honestly, maybe better off being in more of an off ball type role. Although with Giannis, if Giannis is going to be the offense again this coming season, you obviously aren't looking for your point guard to be like super ball dominant anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think when I think about like, okay, well, if you're going to look at somebody from outside the current roster at the guard spot, I tend to gravitate towards ball handlers, and again, caveat everybody, these are not names that are going to like make you feel like we're going to contend for the East with these dudes. Right. But honestly, it's just about like, can you get enough depth around Giannis that, you can basically be competitive. And, I think like, Dennis Schröder obviously has been a guy that has seemingly always killed the Bucks. So I feel like the Bucks have a long history going back to the Herb Cole days. Like it always seems like the Bucks sign guys that are especially good against them. Feels like Schroeder's been sort of like on the periphery as a potential like Bucks target forever. I remember looking at him as a Bucks draft target the year they drafted Giannis. Worked out okay for them. So certainly he's a guy that, I think has come off the bench. He started at times, had a very weird last year where he was like, house on fire for the Nets. And then he ends up going to Golden State, completely flops in Golden State, and then kind of regathered himself a bit in Detroit after the trade deadline and was, solid as a backup there. So, do you add a guy like Schröder who you could start, if needed, but also, if one of those other guys ends up fitting better or outplaying him, like, yeah, Schröder can come off the bench. Like he's done that mostly, right, for the last few years. So, so guys like that, or, Tyus Jones, who, another guy, when you talk about like the Gary Trent Jr. effect, guy that had, obviously, I think he was around like $10 million a year previously. That deal he signed when he was with the Grizzlies, bounces around, ultimately signs a minimum deal with the Suns and puts up good numbers, but obviously nobody came out of that Phoenix situation, smelling like roses. And what's his market now, right? I don't think anybody's going to look at him and say like, that's our starting point guard of the future, folks. And I mean, point guard's probably the ultimate position where if you're a starter, if you're like an average starter, like a 15 to 20 starter in league, if you're Emmanuel Quickly, you're making $30+ million a year. And if you're a like pretty good backup, you are, an order of magnitude below that. And I think guys like Jones and Schröder, again, they are probably great examples of that middle-class death, that the extinction event that, the new CBA was the meteor, 65 million years ago that hit the Yucatan. If we're going to talk about, I have small kids, so I'm, everything becomes a dinosaur metaphor for me. But, that I was kind of wiped out seemingly the like $10 to $20 million contracts for, backup point guards or sort of fringe starter type point guards. So, I mean, again, like certainly the Bucks could have some options there to pursue guys like that at, again, probably more like the taxpayer mid-level. And I often will refer to the taxpayer mid-level, not because the Bucks can't pay more than that, right? But when you look at just where deals tend to gravitate towards, they tend to gravitate towards the mid-level cutoffs, right? So you have tons of guys get minimums, you have tons of guys get right at or below the taxpayer mid-level, because if you pay $1 over that, now you're hard capped at the first apron instead of the second apron, et cetera, et cetera. And then obviously the mid-level, like, if you're a team that's over the cap, you can't pay more than that on a deal either. So again, stuff gets kind of lumpy around those sort of thresholds. So I think Again, like a guy like Schröder could sign a minimum contract somewhere. He could sign for $5 million. Maybe somebody gives him a little more than that. But if you're a team like the Bucks, how do you lure guys for good contracts? You offer them a chance to win, compete for a championship, get the ring chaser guys, or you offer them playing time and an opportunity to build their value, right? And I think for the guards, they could offer both of those things, right? Malik Beasley, Gary Trent Jr., both guys probably looked at Milwaukee as like, hey, I get to play on a really good team with Giannis. I'm going to get to take a ton of open shots, and I can compete for that starting position and actually play a lot. Obviously, the winning part didn't work out so much for those guys, but they both were able to put up numbers. And again, Malik didn't end up cashing in a huge way. We'll see, given he was even better.
Doubled his money.
Yeah, I mean, he was even more prolific last year in Detroit, so maybe he parlays that to even more this summer. We'll see. I don't think he's going to make a ton. And obviously Gary, that's obviously the bigger question for the Bucks. So yeah, we'll kind of see what happens. But I just don't see like a bonanza of spending, and I don't see like some run on like decent fringe starter shooting guards where they're all making $10 million a year. Like I just don't think that's where the league is headed. I think again, teams are going to kind of probably still be conservative and keep their powder dry for players that are just more of difference makers, which no offense to those guys, like they're just not in that kind of class.
Yeah, I mean, I think the free agency class has a lot to do with it as well, especially when you look at the next couple of years compared to this year. And then, as we mentioned, what teams have to spend. So we'll take a look at those things. And the one asset the Bucks do have, Camille and I have talked about a few times, get Frank's thoughts on that. Is there any move where you would put that on the table? We'll dig into that next on Locked On Bucks. So to your point about teams probably keeping their powder dry, it's not a great free agent class that we have here. Next summer, you have the potential of Luka Doncic out there, Paolo Banchero, Jaren Jackson Jr., Chet Holmgren's going to have to get paid next summer. Kristaps Porzingis, maybe he rehabs his value. So in just name value, there's more names out there, better names. De'Aaron Fox as well next season, next offseason versus this offseason. So that's another one of those interesting pieces where I do wonder if we just see teams say, yeah, we're sticking to this, like right around that mid-level cutoff. That's what we're doling out. We think we can lure guys. Like when you look through the list of teams as well that have the taxpayer mid-level to use, there's some interesting teams out there. Teams like the Warriors, the Nuggets, the Lakers, the Knicks. Very interesting now, especially once we find out who their coach is, and the Raptors. I think that's the group of the tax mid-level, and then it's close to half the league that has the non-tax, and you got the biannual that factors in there as well. But the long and short of it is just, I think that's what teams are looking to spend for this group in that $5 to $7-ish million range. And as we just go through this list here, as we've already mentioned, the guards and the number of guys that are likely to be closer to the top of the list than players like Gary Trent Jr. Forward and bigs, not much different either. When you talk about, well, hopefully, I know Bobby and Jericho Sims, the two big ones for Bucks fans, but as you mentioned before, Frank, too, Brook Lopez, that's an interesting one. I mean, of all the guys that the Bucks have that either have a player option or outright free agents, do you think Brook Lopez is going to have the most external interest?
I would guess yes. I don't know if he's going to get, like, I look at Bobby Portis and I just feel like it makes too much sense for him to stay for both sides. Yeah. I just mentally, I don't think he's necessarily going to opt into his player option, but I just think whatever he ends up with is probably going to be in the ballpark of what he's at. Could the Bucks maybe say opt out and we'll give you, I don't know, 3 years, $30 million. So we save some money, but you lock up more kind of longer term, more years. That's certainly possible. But, like, is someone giving Bobby $15 to $16 million a year using cap space, or even like a full mid-level at $14 million a year? Like, is that their big signing? Like, I'm just like kind of skeptical, because he's not going to start for probably anybody, even though we know he's capable of being a like role-playing starter type guy.
And the fact too that there's two names out of Minnesota that I would assume, if that's the route you're going, and there's a flaw with this guy, you're going to pay either of those two guys before you're going to pay Bobby Portis.
Yeah, and so I think it just makes sense in Milwaukee, again, like floor stretching guys that are like legit bigs. And again, we can debate obviously Bobby's defensive, strengths and weaknesses. But I think honestly, I think he had a solid defensive year, like too. Especially with the kind of those best lineups with Giannis. I didn't really feel like teams were consistently exploiting Bobby, in a meaningful way. So yeah, I think it just kind of makes sense to kind of, again, this is all premised on obviously Giannis staying, but if Giannis does stay, and again, if you're Bobby Portis, like how much money would you need? How much more money would you need to get elsewhere to give up kind of like what you have here, right? Because there's a good chance he starts next year, obviously, right?
It's on the table.
Even if Brook comes back, like Bobby could be the starting center, and he's going to play a lot no matter what. Like, Doc likes playing him. He's, a little bit more malleable than Brook is, obviously. So even if you have the same group back, you're going to play 25 minutes, potentially even more, maybe if you start. And what you can do with Giannis, and you're going to be able to get shots, playing without him as in second units and stuff like that. And he's the mayor of Milwaukee, it's like it's comfortable, right?
He was just on Bar Rescue, Frank.
Right, helping out local Milwaukee businesses, being what?
Yeah,
Bobby has mentioned that he does want to get paid. Like he's like, I've taken some deals. I would like to get paid, but
but nobody's gonna like you for because you took.
I would like to get paid too, Camille.
I would too. I
know the money that's out there.
Yeah, it's like some other team should pay you extra because you took a sweetheart deal in your first 2 years of the Bucks. It's like, well, either the Bucks give you that, or probably nobody is. So, I get it. Play a little game of chicken now. Like, don't begrudge him that at all. But just feels like the end point just makes sense for him to come back. But yeah, Brook, I think Brook, you've already sort of heard some of the discussions, right? Like, I don't know what team would target Bobby. I think there's teams, I think the Warriors have been mentioned. The Rockets have had interest, obviously, the last couple of years. I think there are teams that are out there that would want a floor stretching rim protector type like Brook. Not to necessarily play him 32 minutes a game,
right,
but to, even if he's like the backup kind of big guy, I could definitely see that as something that one of these teams would prioritize with, maybe not a full mid-level deal, but is it something around $10 million a year, or at worst around the taxpayer mid-level? The Lakers definitely need big help, right? Talk about a team that could use like a floor stretcher and some size. That's obviously a team that could really use a guy like Brook. And of course, he's from California. So, I'm sure there's some appeal going back to potentially one of the California teams being close to Disneyland. So
the Knicks will be interesting when they hire Bud. Like, that's a name too.
Oh man. So I think Brook probably has like I could see Brook having kind of like the broadest market. And I don't know, and people have been throwing around, like, is there like a sign and trade, right? Like, I think the most popular one was like, oh, like, could you, get Jonathan Kuminga and like a sign and trade? And I'll say this, I don't think, well, Jonathan Kuminga, I haven't thought a lot about where Jonathan Kuminga could end up. Yeah. He's a guy who certainly is probably not going to get paid what he thinks he's worth. But, like, again, sign and trade, okay. If Brook wanted to go to the Warriors, would you sign and trade for Jonathan Kuminga? Sure. I don't really have better ideas, for the Bucks. What would you want to pay him? Well, Brook's not going to get paid. Again, if he's getting paid $10 million a year, then you can't sign and trade for Kuminga like any more than that, right? It's not like you can give Kuminga like $25 million a year, and I wouldn't want to. So would I entertain, like, is there some scenario where something like that could happen? I guess, I think it would be an interesting thing to explore if Brook wanted to go elsewhere. He's an unrestricted free agent, so you can't stop him unless you basically make the case for him to stay. And if Giannis is around, obviously, then certainly Giannis may, really want him to do that. Or if Giannis were to leave, who knows, maybe Brook would want to go where Giannis ended up. But I think Brook is the guy that I think, could be out there. I don't think you're, but I don't think you're like signing and trading Bobby Portis for some real value, elsewhere. I think if usually with guys like that, if it's a sign and trade, it's just basically a sign and trade in order to create a trade exception,
or you get like the 2 second round picks,
exactly, like something very minor. Like nobody's giving up a bunch of stuff for the privilege of paying Bobby Portis, $15 million a year. Like this is not like the way value works in the NBA these days. So I would say the odds of a sign and trade are quite low, but could something happen with Brook? Yeah, maybe could happen. And again, maybe it would just be if it was a team that had that maybe a team only had the mid-level exception or something like that. But or maybe they had maybe a team had like 10 million in cap space or something like that. Is there some situation or like they had an exception and they didn't want to use that, and you end up doing some kind of sign and trade so they don't have to use the exception, and the Bucks created, like there's different kind of versions of this that, or they have a player that, maybe they don't really want, but the Bucks could use, is again, but like you're not getting rich off of Brook Lopez or Bobby Portis sign and trades, right? That's not saving the trajectory of the franchise, but obviously everything certainly worth exploring at this point.
We mentioned the one big asset the Bucks do have. We're up against the clock on this one, so we're gonna have to wrap it over.
Chris Livingston? Is this a Chris Livingston conversation that we're walking into?
How dare you? Number one. We'll wrap that around into tomorrow's show and take a look at the finals as well, which game one will be played later on tonight. But just thoughts about that matchup as we move into that. So that'll come your way on tomorrow's show. For Camille and Frank, I'm Justin. We'll talk with you guys tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.